Libby Franck of Framingham is commissioned by the Framingham History Center to bring to life local women of the past. She portrays a librarian at the Edgell Memorial Library in 1885, the superintendent of the Women's Reformatory in 1949, and a Framingham Center businesswoman who was thrown in the Charles Street Jail for picketing for suffrage in 1920. When the recent celebration of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War was being planned, it was suggested that she look into the life of poet and reformer Julia Ward Howe. Julia's long life was played out in New York, Boston, and Newport. She was at the heart of the artistic and political scene during the 3 decades before the Civil War. Julia's Battle Hymn of the Republic was first sung in 1862 in a Framingham church. And now, here she is.
I am Julia Ward Howe. Every part of my name is a story. Julia. I was named for my mother, Julia Cutler of Jamaica Plain. She too was a published poet. And my sister, Julia. She died at the age of 3, 2 weeks before I was born in 1819. She was the first little Julia. She was good. I was not. I have red hair. Ward. My father was Samuel Ward, a successful New York banker. And he kept us in a series of luxurious mansions in isolation away from society. And there I stayed with only my 3 brothers and 2 sisters as playfellows, and my books and my music. And Howe. My husband was Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, the director of the Perkins Institute for the Blind. Oh, he became very famous when Charles Dickens wrote about his great success with the little deaf blind girl, Laura Bridgman. And when he was very young, he went to Greece to fight in the War of Independence. He was following his idol, Lord Byron. We still have Lord Byron's helmet in our home. The Greek government gave him the title Chevalier. We called him Chev for short. The first time I saw him, it was out the window of the Perkins Institute. He was galloping across a field on a black horse. So, you see, I have been surrounded by more Samuels than the Old Testament. My father was Samuel Ward. My older brother was Sam Ward, Jr. My husband is Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, and my youngest, my little boy, is also Samuel, Jr. I remember a trip I went on with my mother when I must have been about 3 years old, and she took me to upstate New York. I was going to meet an Indian chief, Chief Red Jacket. And my mother gave me a twist of tobacco tied with a blue ribbon, which I was to give to the Indian chief. And she said, now, be sure to notice the silver medal about his neck. It was given to him by General George Washington. Well, I did the wrong thing. When I saw Chief Red Jacket, I threw my arms around his neck. He was not pleased. Neither was my mother. My mother died when I was 5. My brother Sam was 10. My brother Henry was 6. Marion was 4. My sister Louisa was 2. And little Annie had just been born. My father was so sad. He moved us out of the beautiful mansion on Bowling Green with the furniture still in the packing crates. And we moved into a new mansion on Bond Street. I remember shelves and shelves of books. Now, when I first learned to read, the first book I remember was called The Iroquois Bride. And I thought it would make a lovely play, so I invited the family as the audience. And I, of course, got to be the Iroquois bride. And my little brother Marion was my lover. And we climbed on a footstool and stabbed each other to death. Well, the adults were shocked. The book was taken away from me. My 3 brothers were sent off to boarding school. I was always addressed as Miss Ward by the servants, since I was the oldest daughter. And there I was, alone with my books and my music and my study of foreign languages. But then my brother Sam became engaged to Emily Astor, the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor, the richest man in all of New York City. You know, what a plethora of parties surrounded their engagement and their wedding. At last, my dancing lessons were put to good use. And at their wedding, I was the first bridesmaid. But then, the angel of death stalked my family. My father died in 1839 following the stock market crash. And my brother Henry died of typhoid fever in my arms. And Sam's wife, Emily, she died in childbirth. The only thing that could ease my sorrow was writing poetry. Then I went to Boston to visit with a girl who had been engaged to my late brother, and it was she, along with Longfellow and Charles Sumner, who introduced me to Chev. We always called him Chev. It was a tempestuous relationship. At my wedding, I was granted the right to keep my own name. I would be known as Mrs. Julia Ward Howe, not Mrs. Samuel Gridley Howe. But that was all of myself that was left to me. We returned after a year's time, a honeymoon in Europe, and we came back to Boston with our firstborn, a little girl named Julia Romana, since she'd been born in the Eternal City. And then I had to live at the Perkins Institute in South Boston. It was far, far away from Boston proper, and the omnibus to take you there only came once every 2 hours. So the first thing I did was I had another baby, a little girl we called Florence, after her godmother, Florence Nightingale. I was a terrible cook and housekeeper. And Chev always wanted me to cook elaborate dinners for his friends. My father had always told me, Julia, you should work on your cooking. But no, I would rather study German. My only music was singing songs to my babies. I wanted to write poetry, but instead I had 2 more babies. A son named Henry and a little girl named Laura, named after the little deaf-blind girl, Laura Bridgman. But then I got a holiday. I went to Rome for 9 months. Chev sailed back to Boston, and I stayed there with my sister and my 2 youngest babies. Ah, Rome. I knew a day of glad surprise in Rome, free to the childish joy of wandering. I strayed, amassing wildflowers, ivy leaves, thoughts of unending beauty from the fields. But then I had to go back to Boston, to my cross husband and all my children and my cares. But I did manage to write some poetry. And all the while I was helping Chev edit an abolition newspaper. And then I had my poems published. The book was called Passion Flowers. Oh, Chev was furious. A woman should only live for her husband and her children. Her voice should not be heard in the wide world. But then the politics of slavery dominated our lives. He'd been an abolitionist for decades, and now I was one too. He said to me, the radical John Brown will pay a visit to you this afternoon. You will receive him. So that afternoon, the bell rang at our place in South Boston, and there was a middle-aged man, middle-sized, with amber hair and beard streaked with gray, and I said, I'm very glad to meet you. My husband has spoken so very highly of you. And sometime later, I was the one who noticed in the paper the news of the attack on Harper's Ferry. I pointed it out to Chev, and he said, Brown has gotten to work. And then when Brown was hanged, the bells of Boston rang out in lamentation. And when war broke out in 1862, Chev was appointed the head of the Sanitary Commission, and he made many trips to Washington to inspect the troops. And I went with him on November of 1861. And after inspecting the troops, I accepted the challenge of Reverend James Freeman Clarke to write new words to the tune of John Brown's body. I went to sleep in the Willard Hotel, and I awakened in the gray light of early dawn. And as I lay there, words began forming in my mind. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Line after line, verse after verse, until it was all done. I found some paper and a pen, and I wrote down the words and went back to sleep. When I awakened, I remembered what had happened, but I couldn't remember the words. But I looked down, and there they were. I thought, I like this better than anything else I have ever written. I sent it to the Atlantic Monthly, and it was published in February 1862. The Battle Hymn of the Republic. At last, I had found a way to serve the Union cause.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, 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 hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.